Brexit is a risk. That's always been so, although you'd be forgiven for thinking that there was any risk at all on either the Leave or the Remain sides. For the narrative on both sides has been one of certainty. In terms of who had the head start in the argument about outcomes, the Remain side had a pretty solid base on which to stand. The Remain side will go through all the possible outcomes as negatives, in contrast to the one certainty which they thought was all right. Remain meant to keep things as they are. Everybody remained fed and watered. Everybody's job would remain as it is now. The UK would remain the fifth or sixth richest country in the world. All those things would remain so long as we did remain. Their argument was, why rock the boat? By leaving and not remaining, everything was at risk. Jobs would be lost if we left, rather than might be lost. Britain's standing in the world would be reduced, rather than that it might be reduced. The NHS would be sold off to Donald Trump, rather than there is a small possibility that US drugs companies might want to become suppliers to the NHS. Leavers, on the other hand, tended not to talk of risk, but of the other side of that coin, opportunity. Everybody will be better off, rather than they might be. There will be jobs created as we go into new export markets, rather than that there might be. The UK will be richer as a result, rather than that it might be. The NHS will be forced to become more efficient, rather than that its scope might be cut. It's too early to tell whether the Leavers are right, but on current evidence, the Remainers' claims of catastrophes and plagues of locusts do seem to be fairly wide of the mark. But time will tell. But of all the risks that Remainers have warned us of, the one that is most likely to happen, and to my mind the greatest risk of all, in the sense of an outcome being undesirable that is the separation of Scotland from the rest of the UK. I was worried that it might go the other way in 2014, and so was David Cameron. He was, in fact, like the rest of the establishment, rattled enough to go on a serious charm offensive in the final week of the campaign. As it was, the Scots voted decisively to stay within the Union. Whether the appearance in their midst of a very posh, very, very English Aldertonian helped or hindered the cause of the Union is hard to say, but it obviously didn't harm the Union side enough to cause them to lose. But it was a warning shot across the bows of the Union, and although the result wasn't that close, it was close enough for the Scottish nationalists to smell enough blood in the water for them to believe that it only needed one change in circumstance, or one particular event that might just tip the scales in their favour. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your point of view, David Cameron, under pressure from Nigel Farage and UKIP, provided them with just such an event less than 2 years later, with the European Union referendum of 2016. Now we have the prospect of the breakup of a union that has lasted for over 3 centuries, in order for that union to remove itself from another union that has been part of for less than 2 generations. This is all very complicated, and it makes mincemeat of everybody's supposed principled stances on the 2 issues. I am painfully aware of the intellectual contortions that I have to make in order to believe that the UK must be allowed to follow its star and once again be independent of the European Union, whilst at the same time be less enthusiastic about Scotland doing the same thing with regard to its relationship with the rest of the UK. And let's be honest about this, England. It is tricky, to be sure, but it's no trickier than a Scottish nationalist insisting that Scotland must be free of England, but that the UK must not be allowed to separate itself from the EU because the majority in Scotland favour the UK remaining within the EU. It's tricky, but I believe that it can be done. And the reason that I believe that it can be done is that it can be done if it is approached from a position of good faith. So here's my position of good faith. See what you think. Without getting too emotional about this, as a British patriot, I don't love only England. I love Scotland too, as I do Wales and Ulster. It's probably true to say that I don't love it as much, since I don't know it as well as I know England. But I did live in Scotland for a year or so, Troon, if you're interested, and have spent a good chunk of my working life around its coastline. So I'm not a stranger to Scotland. I have worked with a lot of Scots, and I've always got on well with them. There is an easy banter there, which is the product of a shared heritage. That's a product of 3 centuries informing the conversation. That's not a surface thing. That goes deep, whether you like to acknowledge it or not. But I'm not imperious about Scotland. I don't think of it as the last remnants of my British Empire. I was having a discussion about this very thing with a bloke from Scotland in my aforementioned work, and he was saying to me plaintively, but everywhere else has gone independent. Canada, India, Jamaica, Kenya, Singapore. Why won't you let us go independent? But I think he was missing the point. All of those other places were colonies. They were rightly, or more probably wrongly, colonies. They were colonies not of England, but of Britain, which in effect made them also colonies of Scotland. Remember, it was the British and not the English Empire. Scotland was a part of the whole. Scotland was the mother country, just as England was. I think that he thought that England was senior to Scotland, or at least he thought that I thought that. And if you are Scottish and you do think that, then that is a problem. It's also a problem if you're English and you think that, but it's obviously not as acute a problem. For a Scot, that's humiliating, I would guess. England is only a little bigger than Scotland, but it does have 11 times the population. So he's always going to have a greater heft, purely by dint of the greater numbers. But proportionately, Scotland more than punches above its weight, just as the UK as a whole does internationally. And it's always worth remembering that as part of the mother country, the Scots were some of the most enthusiastic empire builders. In these times of everybody being tremendously ashamed of everything Britain did in the past, you might want to keep that to yourself, but it's an established fact. You know, when facts actually meant something. But there is a resentment that manifests itself as an anti-English prejudice. And I will call it a prejudice in the truest sense of the word, a prejudging towards all English people from some quarters in Scotland. It's not universal, as is evidenced by the 2014 referendum, but it is there, and I have to say, not without some justification. My feeling is that resentment towards England started when the big industries that Scotland was busily engaged in started to falter in the 70s, along with many similar industries in England, Wales and in Northern Ireland. And anybody who's ever been made redundant knows that feeling. The sense that you are not required anymore, not valued, and finally dismissed as an irrelevance. And that's pretty hard to take. And it's pretty hard to take for a country, for any country. And particularly for a country that has given the world telephones, television, penicillin, the steam engine, the car tyre, bicycles, etc., etc., etc. The list goes on and on. Some of the greatest ships ever to set sail, such as the Queens Mary and Elizabeth and the QE2, came out of the shipbuilders of the Clyde, not to mention building a fair chunk of the Royal Navy at its largest and most powerful. And then all of a sudden, as it probably seemed, it all stopped dead in about 1973. And that coincidentally was when the UK joined the common market. I'm not suggesting those two things were connected, much less that the EU is somehow to blame for Scotland's relative decline. But it's curious that Nicola Sturgeon now makes much of Scotland being dragged out of the EU against its will. But I suspect that the resentment resentment toward England is part of a general phenomenon of smaller countries towards large and overbearing neighbours, like Canada towards the US, Belgium towards France, Holland towards Germany, or Portugal towards Spain. But the animus to England has real bite to it, which is surprising considering almost any small British military unit will have a Scot amongst that band of brothers who will fight and die for each other. And it is that bite which may yet render the UK in half. And I, for one, would like to stop that from happening. So how do we do that? Well, are you ready? Because here is my idea. We make Glasgow the capital city of the UK. Hear me out. London will remain the capital of England, as it has been for a millennium, and Edinburgh could remain the capital city of Scotland. Resentment builds when people think that they and their needs, wants and aspirations are being ignored. This is a way of addressing them, albeit indirectly. London, as I say, will remain the English capital. Its unassailable position as the financial, cultural and entertainment capital of the UK, if not of Europe, will also remain. Indeed, London's status as an international centre of finance will scarcely be affected, so enormous is its lead. But many of the world's most successful countries have a capital that is not the largest city. The US, Canada, Brazil, India, Australia, New Zealand, Nigeria, South Africa, and it does them no harm. London need not be diminished at all and could still retain the lustre of the monarchy, for instance. Edinburgh can remain the administrative seat of the Scottish government, required as it is to purely govern Scotland. The moving of the UK capital Glasgow could be part of a wider movement to give the neglected English regions their own assemblies, as many have been calling for some time. Now, I know this seems a radical, even a daft idea, and is not a cheap ploy to buy the loyalty of Scotland, which is something I'm convinced cannot actually be bought. But it could have, and probably would have, a beneficial long-term effect. Moving Parliament to Glasgow would over time drag the political centre of gravity northwards, as those individuals, businesses and institutions felt that they needed to be closer to the seat of power, which would move north with it. The concerns of Scotland will be at Parliament's doorstep, and therefore much more likely to be addressed. This would also reverse the deleterious effect of London being in the southeast corner of Great Britain, as it is at the moment. At present, London acts like an enormous black hole, with its considerable gravity sucking everything, including population, resources, and the cream of investment towards it, whilst at the same time sucking the life out of towns and villages that are within 100 miles or more, depending on the speed of the rail link to London. This would have an effect of rebalancing the country, drawing money and resources away from the crowded southeast towards the less populated areas of far northern England and Scotland. Over time, the effect of the capital not being 400 miles away in the farthest reaches of England will have a positive effect on the cohesiveness of England and Scotland. London will still have the money, but Glasgow will have the power. Many will argue that the capital of the UK should remain in England, since to place it in Scotland places Scotland over and above the status of both Wales and Northern Ireland. And that's a fair point, but only as far as it goes, since having the capital in England places England over and above the status of Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland. And in a family of nations, such as the UK uniquely is, one member cannot, with any real justification, lord it over the others. Any justification other than raw power, that is. To object to Scotland having the capital on the grounds that it makes Wales and Northern Ireland seemingly less important seems to be valid, until you realise that to insist on it being in England merely assumes that England is the dominant partner, whilst the other three nations are subservient to it. Why should Scotland have it, you may ask? when Wales and Ulster do not. But by the same token, why should England? If we are a family of nations, surely all four nations should have an equal claim to host the seat of government. But the messy issue of what do Wales and Northern Ireland get in compensation for not having the seat of government remains. I don't yet have an answer for that, but I'm sure there might be one that could satisfy both nations. The National Sports Stadium was for a while in Cardiff, which was a small step in the right direction, until the London-centric mentality reasserted itself when the new Wembley Stadium was built, hundreds of miles away from football's heartland in the northwest. But if it can't be resolved, then maybe it is better for the capital to stay in England. If that is so, Manchester is a good compromise, being close to Wales and Northern Ireland, and only half as distant from Scotland as London is. But the real danger, the clear and present one, is that it is Scotland and not Wales or even Northern Ireland that will want to tear the UK in two. Holistically and symbolically, this would be a catastrophe, if not actually economically. In fact, economically, it might be argued that England would be better off without Scotland, when factoring in the Barnett formula, which increases the amount spent per head of population to the tune of 15 to 20% in Scotland over and above what is spent on English citizens. The same applies equally to Wales and Northern Ireland, as it happens. As a Brit and an Englishman, I'm personally happy to pay this extra to keep the family together. However, with the resurgence of English nationalism that Brexit has unleashed, there are many in England weary of the attacks of the Scottish nationalists who are not. The absoluteness with which Scottish football supporters resolutely support anyone else, and I do mean anyone who plays England at football, may be looked upon just as vigorous teasing, but there is a real nastiness to it. Not that I have much interest in football, but I will support any of the home nations when they are playing anyone else. Of course, I'm English, so I will support England against Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland. But if England is not involved, I will support one of the other teams, and that includes Scotland. But there are many in England who feel the need to retaliate and will support anyone against Scotland. I can tell that their hearts are not in it, but they do it just the same. In my experience, the same does not apply to Wales, which is surprising, considering that the Welsh have at least as much, or not, to grumble about when it comes to the English. To any Scots who may be watching this, and I hope they are, just consider for the moment the question on the Scottish independence ballot paper of 2014. The question was, should Scotland be an independent country? That's fairly straightforward, you might have thought. But put yourselves in the shoes of the English. How do you think that they felt about the question? I'm betting that you would never have thought about it. After all, it was none of our business, right? Well, okay. But now consider this. How would you feel as Scots if we, the English, had had a referendum that asked the same question? How would you have felt if the English had had a referendum that had a referendum question of, should England be an independent country? How would you have felt if we, as England, had unilaterally decided to separate England off from Scotland? Of course, if we had been asked such a thing, the implication would have been that not only Scotland, but Ulster and Wales were also to be separated. How would you have felt if we decided that we just didn't want you anymore? You see, like my workmate in Scotland, everybody is missing the point. Scotland is not an independent country. But then, neither is England. Scotland is not independent of England, and neither is England independent of Scotland. Scotland can no more gain its independence from England than it can from Wales. You may say this is pedantics, and to a certain degree you'd be right. But the principle isn't right. The principle is that the United Kingdom is made up of 4 nations under one flag, but none is more important than another. The principle is that Scotland is the equal of England. Like I say, England naturally carries more clout because there are 56 million English citizens and only 5.5 million Scots. And if I may be so bold, I would politely suggest that if we are to use that metric, perhaps Scottish nationalists believe themselves to be more important than their Welsh or Northern Irish cousins, simply because there are more of you. And that won't do at all, will it? So as I've said before in another video that very few people watched, I don't wish to lord it over Scotland like one of Ewan McGregor's effete English wankers. Actually, at least one Scot did watch it and sent me a comment that started, "Dear English wanker." I want people in Scotland to know that I don't want you to leave us. I don't want you to make us foreigners. Now, I know a lot of English people will be quite happy to see you go and will wave you off with a cheery best of luck and will not realise or will choose to ignore the insult that is at least implied. And because of the increasingly belligerent stance taken by the SNP, there are an increasing number of Englishmen who will pretend that they are only too happy to see you go, and they won't be wishing you the best of luck. But they will be hurting inside, despite what they may say. And there is another aspect to this, which I've touched upon before. A separated Scotland will have no independence within the European Union, even assuming that Scotland will be readmitted, which is quite an assumption considering what has been going on in Catalonia. The European Union doesn't do independence. But don't take my word for it. Just have a listen to Guy Verhofstadt, who believes that the lesson of Brexit is not more independence for sovereign states, but much, much less. It's been a common trope of the opponents of Leave that the price of Brexit will be the breakup of the UK. As I say, of all the scare stories associated with Brexit, this is the one that is most feasible. But I suspect that Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP will allow their animus for the English to cloud their judgment and interfere with what is best for Scotland. You're a canny bunch, you lot, north of the wall. In fact, the very word canny seems to be invented just for you. So I'm sure that you'll give this the right amount of thought. So what do you all think of my idea? I'm interested to know. From Scots in particular, but also from my compatriots in Wales and Northern Ireland, as well as in England. Of course, Scotland will do what Scotland wants to do, and there is certainly nothing that Boris Johnson, nor 56 million English people, can do about it. We all know this. But my appeal to you is to not let the SNP's hatred of the English tear this family apart. We can change it for the better. Please don't go. We need you.